The can opener slipped in Frank Delacroix's arthritic fingers, the jagged metal edge slicing deep into his thumb as he tried to open what he didn't yet know would be his final Christmas dinner. Blood, bright red and surprisingly warm, dripped steadily into the pale chicken noodle soup below, each drop creating tiny crimson clouds that bloomed and disappeared like everything else he'd ever loved. Frank stared at the spreading pink stain in his soup and laughed. Actually laughed. Here he was, 74 years old, bleeding into Campbell's on Christmas night while his 3 successful children celebrated with families that actually wanted them around. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted by a particularly cruel God. But what happened in the next 4 hours would destroy 3 families forever. The microwave hummed its monotonous tune, casting the only light in a kitchen that had once been the heart of a home but now felt like a mausoleum. Frank wrapped his bleeding thumb in a paper towel that immediately soaked through, the white cotton turning red like a surrender flag. Everything in this house was surrendering now. The peeling wallpaper Sarah had picked out 20 years ago, the loose floorboard by the sink that Frank kept meaning to fix, the marriage photos on the refrigerator that curled at the edges like dying flowers. Outside, snow fell with the kind of relentless determination that transforms the world into something beautiful and false. Through the kitchen window, Frank could see the Martinez house blazing with warm light, could hear the laughter of 3 generations celebrating together under one roof. Carlos had waved from his driveway this morning while loading presents into his car. "Merry Christmas, Frank. You have plans today?" Frank had smiled and lied without hesitation. "Oh yes, the kids are coming by later." The lie had felt necessary then. Now it sat in his stomach like poison, mixing with the knowledge that his phone had remained silent for 14 hours and 17 minutes. Not one call. Not one text. Not even a generic "Merry Christmas" message sent to his entire contact list. For the first time in 74 years, Frank Delacroix was spending Christmas completely alone. The truly devastating part wasn't the loneliness, it was the creeping realization that this abandonment wasn't sudden or unexpected. It had been building for 3 years, one missed call and cancelled visit at a time, until Frank had become someone his own children actively avoided. When exactly had he stopped being their father and become their obligation? 3 weeks ago, when the first snow dusted the maple trees that Sarah had planted when they bought this house 42 years ago, Frank had called Michael. His eldest son, 45 and successful, living in Seattle with a wife who smiled in family photos but looked through Frank like he was made of glass. "Hey, Mike," Frank had said, settling into the recliner that still held the impression of his body after 3 years of solo evenings. "I was thinking about Christmas. I know it's early, but maybe you could come out this year. I could make Mom's prime rib recipe." The pause lasted exactly 4 seconds too long. "Dad, that's really sweet, but you know how far Seattle is from Pennsylvania. I could pay for your flights." Another pause. Frank could hear his daughter-in-law Kristen in the background, something sharp and impatient about soccer schedules and pickup times. It's too far for you, Dad. All that cooking and hosting at your age. You're not getting any younger." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Not too far for Michael to travel, too far to expect his aging father to matter enough to make the effort worthwhile. Too much trouble for too little reward. "I understand," Frank had said, though he absolutely did not. "Maybe next year, okay? When things settle down." Next year. Frank had learned to recognize that phrase as the polite way adult children say never. But Michael's rejection was gentle compared to what came next. Jenny lived 43 miles away in suburban Philadelphia. 43 miles, closer than Michael drove to his fancy gym twice a week, closer than the outlet mall she posted about visiting every weekend. Close enough to matter, if he still mattered. "Oh, Dad," Jenny had said when he mentioned Christmas, and Frank could actually hear the exact moment she started formulating her excuse. "The kids have that stomach bug that's been going around Emma's school. You know how these things spread in elementary schools. We can't risk getting you sick." Funny thing about that stomach bug, it cleared up remarkably fast when Jenny posted Facebook pictures 2 days later of Emma and Jack ice skating at the outdoor rink, rosy-cheeked and laughing like they'd never been sick a day in their lives. Tommy, his youngest at 34, hadn't even bothered with creativity. "I'm completely swamped, Dad. This new marketing position is absolutely killing me. Can we do a rain check?" Tommy, who somehow found time for a ski vacation in Vail with his girlfriend Chelsea. Tommy, who posted 17 Instagram stories on Christmas Day, drinking champagne and laughing with Chelsea's parents like he'd been part of their family his entire life. So here Frank sat, bleeding into soup that tasted like cardboard and loneliness, surrounded by the ghosts of 43 Christmas mornings that used to matter. The microwave beeped. Frank pulled out the bowl with his good hand, scorching hot, because even the microwave was trying to hurt him tonight, and sat down at the kitchen table where Sarah had served Christmas dinner for 37 years. This was the same table where Jenny had announced her engagement, where Michael had cried when his college girlfriend broke up with him, where Tommy had brought his report cards for proud examination. The same table where Sarah had balanced the checkbook every Sunday night, where she'd planned menus and grocery lists, where she'd sat with her coffee and crossword puzzles every morning until the cancer made her too weak to hold a pen. Now it was just Frank and Campbell's soup, the steam rising like tiny ghosts of everything he'd lost. The house felt enormous when you were alone in it. Every room echoed with conversations that weren't happening. Every creak of the old floorboard sounded like footsteps that would never come. Frank had considered downsizing after Sarah died, but this house contained every memory of their life together. The pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe tracking the kids' heights, the dent in the living room wall from Tommy's indoor baseball practice, the burn mark on the counter from Jenny's disastrous attempt at Mother's Day breakfast in bed. Moving would mean admitting that all those memories were just artifacts now, museum pieces from a life that was over. Frank forced himself to take a spoonful of soup. It was simultaneously too hot and completely flavorless, like everything else in his life lately. The blood from his cut thumb had given it a metallic aftertaste that made his stomach revolt, but he kept eating anyway. Fuel for the body, nothing more. Christmas dinner reduced to mechanical necessity. But what Frank didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he sat there choking down bloody soup in his empty kitchen, was that Maria Santos was at that very moment standing in her own kitchen 3 houses down, looking at a plate of homemade tamales and making a decision that would change everything. Through his kitchen window, Frank could see the warm light spilling from the Martinez house across the street. Carlos and Rosa had 3 generations celebrating under that roof tonight, their adult children, their grandchildren, probably Rosa's ancient mother who spoke no English but somehow made everyone feel welcome just by being there. Frank could hear their laughter even through his closed windows, could smell the tamales Rosa had been preparing for 3 days. This morning, Carlos had waved enthusiastically from his driveway while loading presents into his car. "Merry Christmas, Frank. You have big plans today." Frank had smiled and delivered his rehearsed lie. "Oh yes, the kids are coming by later." Carlos had beamed and nodded, and Frank had retreated into his house to wait for children who were never coming. The lie sat heavy in his chest now, mixing with the soup and the shame. Why was it so impossible to admit the truth? Why couldn't he just say that somewhere along the way, he'd become the kind of father his children felt obligated to call on holidays but never actually wanted to see? Frank's phone buzzed on the counter. For one wild, desperate moment, his heart leaped. Maybe Jenny was calling to check on him. Maybe Michael had changed his mind about the distance. Maybe Tommy had realized that work could wait one day for the father who'd raised him. It was a robocall about his car warranty. Frank laughed again, a sound that came out harsh and bitter in the silent kitchen. Even the scammers only wanted him for his money. He shuffled into the living room, where Sarah's Christmas village still covered the entire mantelpiece. 46 tiny ceramic houses, one for each year of their marriage. Each house carefully chosen, each one carrying its own memory. The Victorian cottage from their first Christmas as newlyweds, when they were so broke they bought each other used books and felt rich because they had love. The little church from the year Michael was born, when Frank had driven Sarah to midnight mass through a blizzard because she insisted their unborn baby needed to hear Christmas carols from the womb. The red schoolhouse from Jenny's first day of kindergarten, when she'd cried and clung to Sarah's leg until Frank had to physically carry her to the classroom. The miniature fire station from the year Tommy decided he wanted to be a fireman, before he discovered architecture, then business, then marketing, then whatever soul-crushing corporate job kept him too busy for his father. Each house glowed with tiny battery-powered lights, creating 46 little windows into 46 little worlds where ceramic families gathered around microscopic tables, all looking impossibly happy to be together. It was pathetic, really. A grown man getting emotional over toy houses and Christmas decorations. But these weren't just ornaments. They were the archaeological evidence of a love that had lasted decades, the physical proof that Frank had once mattered to people, had once been essential to someone's happiness. Now they looked like tiny shrines to a life that was over. Frank collapsed into his recliner, Sarah's matching chair still sitting empty beside it like a reproach, and closed his eyes. Maybe he could just sleep through the rest of Christmas. Wake up tomorrow when the holiday was over and he could stop pretending it didn't feel like dying. But every time his eyelids closed, he saw Christmas mornings from before. Jenny tearing through wrapping paper like a tiny hurricane, squealing with delight over every gift. Michael, always methodical and careful, saving the best present for last and savoring every moment. Tommy bouncing off the walls with excitement until Sarah finally gave him permission to wake everyone at dawn. Sarah in her faded red bathrobe, making coffee and pancakes while Frank assembled whatever ridiculously complicated toy required an engineering degree and the patience of a saint. The house full of chaos and noise and the particular kind of joy that only comes from watching people you love be completely, unself-consciously happy. When had that stopped being enough for them? When had Christmas at Dad's house become something to endure instead of anticipate? Frank knew the answer, even though thinking about it felt like pressing on a bruise. It had started 3 years ago, the first Christmas after Sarah's funeral. The first Christmas without her laugh, without her endless planning and organizing, without her supernatural ability to make everything feel magical. Frank had tried to recreate that magic single-handedly. He'd cooked too much food and bought too many presents and worked himself into exhaustion trying to be both mother and father to children who were already grown and gone and living their own lives. The kids had come that year, but everything felt wrong. Forced. They'd eaten his overcooked turkey and opened presents with polite smiles and left as soon as they decently could, citing long drives and early meetings and babysitters who couldn't stay late. Frank had spent that New Year's Eve alone, surrounded by enough leftover food to feed a small army and the crushing realization that he didn't know how to be a family of one. The second Christmas, only Jenny had come, and she'd brought Emma and Jack but left David at home with some transparent excuse about work deadlines. They'd stayed exactly 3 hours. Frank had watched the clock, with the kids clearly bored and restless, Jenny checking her phone every 5 minutes like she was looking for an emergency that would justify escape. Last Christmas, they'd all found reasons not to come. Work emergencies. Bad weather. Prior commitments they claimed they'd forgotten about. Frank had driven to Jenny's house on Christmas afternoon and sat in his car across the street like some kind of stalker, watching through their living room window as his daughter and grandchildren opened presents and created memories that didn't include him. That's when Frank had realized the terrible truth. He'd become someone his children visited out of obligation instead of love. Someone they endured rather than enjoyed. Someone who made them feel guilty instead of glad. The realization should have motivated him to change, to find a way back to being the kind of father they wanted to spend time with. Instead, it had made him bitter. Resentful, the kind of parent who asked pointed questions about why they never called, who made comments about how long it had been since their last visit, who kept careful track of every slight and disappointment. The kind of parent who kept score. And children, Frank had learned the hard way, never forgive parents who keep score. A commercial flickered on the television, something about family traditions and holiday memories. A grandmother surrounded by children and grandchildren, everyone laughing and hugging and looking like they'd stepped out of a greeting card. The kind of Christmas that existed in advertisements and other people's lives but never seemed to happen in real families. Frank grabbed the remote and clicked off the TV, plunging the room into silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. The house was haunted by all the Christmases that used to be, all the laughter that used to echo through these rooms, all the love that had once made this place feel like the center of the universe. Sarah's presence was everywhere and nowhere, in every photograph on every surface, in every empty chair and abandoned tradition, in every room that felt too big and too quiet and too full of memories that hurt to remember. Frank missed her so much it felt like drowning in slow motion. Sarah would have known how to fix this. She would have found a way to bridge the growing gap between Frank and their children. She would have made peace instead of keeping score, would have loved them back to him instead of driving them further away with expectations and disappointment and a kind of needy desperation that made people want to run. But Sarah was gone, and Frank was alone, and Christmas had become just another day to survive. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times. 8 o'clock on Christmas night, and Frank had somehow managed to endure the worst of it. Tomorrow would be easier. Tomorrow he could pretend Christmas had never happened, could go back to the numbing routine of grocery shopping and doctor appointments and television shows that helped him forget how empty his life had become. That's when he heard the knock. Frank froze in his recliner, soup spoon halfway to his mouth. Who visited on Christmas night? Kids playing pranks? Someone with car trouble? A neighbor checking to see if the old man was still alive? The knock came again, not urgent or demanding, just patient. Steady. Like whoever was standing on his porch had all the time in the world and wasn't going anywhere until someone answered. Frank muted the television and listened. The knock repeated, soft but persistent. Polite, even. Almost apologetic. Against every instinct screaming at him to ignore it, Frank hauled himself out of his chair and walked to the front door. The porch light cast a warm yellow glow over the snow-covered steps, and through the peephole he could see a small figure in a red cardigan, holding something covered with aluminum foil. Maria Santos. The widow who lived 3 houses down, the one who kept her tiny lawn absolutely perfect and always waved when Frank checked his mailbox. The one whose daughter lived in Phoenix and whose son was stationed somewhere in Germany, both good kids who called every week but couldn't make it home for the holidays. Frank opened the door, and cold air rushed in along with the scent of cinnamon and masa and something that smelled like home used to smell when Sarah was alive. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Frank," Maria said, her voice soft with the musical accent that reminded Frank of his grandmother, who'd immigrated from Ireland and never quite lost the lilt of her homeland. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "No bother at all," Frank managed, though he couldn't imagine why this woman was standing on his porch on Christmas night, holding what was clearly food and looking at him with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for injured animals. Maria lifted the covered plate slightly. "I made too much food tonight. Always happens when you cook for a family that isn't coming." She said it without self-pity, just a simple statement of fact that hit Frank like a punch to the solar plexus. "I thought maybe you might like some tamales. My grandmother's recipe from Guadalajara." Frank stared at this small woman standing in the falling snow, offering him homemade food and human kindness when his own children couldn't be bothered to send a text message. Something cracked inside his chest, not breaking exactly, but shifting. Like ice beginning to thaw after a long, brutal winter. "You didn't have to do that," Frank said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I know," Maria said simply. "But it's Christmas. Nobody should eat alone on Christmas." The words hit Frank with devastating accuracy. This woman barely knew him. They'd exchanged pleasantries over the back fence, waved from their respective driveways, helped each other with packages when the delivery trucks came. But somehow she'd recognized something in him that his own children had missed, that he was alone and hurting and in desperate need of the kind of basic human kindness that shouldn't be remarkable but somehow was. "Would you?" Frank swallowed hard, surprised by how difficult the words were to form. "Would you like to come in? I was just having some soup." Maria's face lit up like Frank had offered her a precious gift instead of the other way around. "I would like that very much." But what neither of them knew, what they couldn't possibly know as Frank stepped aside to let this stranger into his house, was that this single act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would destroy 3 families and change the course of multiple lives forever. What happens next will shock you, break your heart, and make you question everything you think you know about family, love, and the devastating cost of taking people for granted. Because sometimes the most ordinary moments carry the most extraordinary consequences, and sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what you never bothered to protect. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time someone showed up for you when your own family didn't. Have you ever felt like Frank, keeping score instead of keeping faith? Share your story. You're not alone in this. And if this story is hitting you in the chest the way I think it is, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that love shows up in small ways, in ordinary moments, in the choice to knock on someone's door with a plate of food when the rest of the world has forgotten they exist. Because what happened next changed everything. Frank stepped aside to let Maria in, taking the warm plate from her hands. It was heavier than he'd expected, substantial in a way that spoke of real care and intention. The kind of meal that said someone had thought about him specifically, had considered his loneliness and decided to do something about it. "Your house is beautiful," Maria said, looking around the living room with genuine appreciation. Her eyes lingered on the Christmas village, on the family photographs covering every surface, on the evidence of a life that had once been full and vibrant and loved. "My wife decorated most of it," Frank said, his voice catching slightly on the word wife. Even after 3 years, Sarah's absence felt fresh in moments like this, when someone new saw their home through unfamiliar eyes. "She's not. 3 years ago. Cancer." Maria's expression softened with the kind of understanding that only comes from walking the same dark path. "My husband died young too. Heart attack at 52. 28 years ago now, but sometimes it feels like yesterday." They stood there for a moment in Frank's entryway, 2 people who understood that grief doesn't follow schedules or heal according to other people's timelines. That loneliness could be a chronic condition, managed but never quite cured, always ready to flare up when you least expected it. "Come on," Frank said finally, his voice steadier now. "Let's see what you brought me." In the kitchen, Maria uncovered the plate to reveal a dozen perfect tamales, each one wrapped in corn husks and tied with strips of husk like tiny presents. The masa looked light and fluffy, the kind that spoke of hours of patient hand-beating. Beside them sat a container of Spanish rice studded with peas and carrots, and another container of what looked like bread pudding but smelled like heaven. "Rice pudding," Maria explained, catching Frank's questioning look. "With cinnamon and vanilla and just a touch of condensed milk. My son Roberto's favorite when he was little. He used to say it tasted like clouds." Frank's throat tightened unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had cooked his favorite anything? When was the last time someone had thought about what might bring him comfort and then spent hours making it happen? "This is incredible," Frank said, lifting one of the tamales with reverent care. The corn husk was still warm, and he could smell the complex blend of spices that spoke of traditions passed down through generations. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll eat with me," Maria said, and to Frank's amazement, she began pulling real plates from a bag he hadn't noticed. Not paper plates or disposable containers, but actual china plates wrapped in cloth napkins, along with real silverware that caught the kitchen light. She'd planned this. Had thought about Frank sitting alone with his canned soup and decided that wasn't acceptable. Had packed a proper meal with proper dishes because she believed he deserved better than eating alone on Christmas. They sat at the kitchen table where Frank had consumed so many solitary meals, and suddenly the space felt transformed. Smaller somehow, more intimate. The oppressive silence that had made eating alone feel like punishment now felt comfortable, companionable. "Tell me about these tamales," Frank said after taking his first bite. The flavor exploded across his tongue, tender pork slow-cooked with chilies and cumin, masa that practically melted in his mouth, and something indefinable that tasted like love had been stirred right into the mixture. "My grandmother taught me when I was 7 years old," Maria said, settling into Sarah's chair like she belonged there. "She said the secret was in the masa. You have to beat it until it's so light it floats on water. And you have to sing while you work." "Sing," she said. "Food made without music has no soul." Maria laughed, a sound that filled Frank's kitchen with more warmth than it had felt in months. "I still sing when I cook. My neighbors probably think the old Mexican lady has lost her mind." Frank tried to remember the last time he'd heard singing in this kitchen. Sarah used to hum unconsciously while she cooked, turning ordinary Tuesday night dinners into celebrations just by being happy. The silence after she died had been deafening. "What do you sing?" Frank asked, genuinely curious. "Christmas songs tonight. Silent Night, in Spanish, Noche de Paz. Los Peques en el Rio. Songs my grandmother sang to me when I was small and the world seemed full of magic." Frank felt something stir in his chest, something that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Hope, maybe. Or just the radical concept that joy might still be possible. "Would you?" Frank paused, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. "Would you sing something now?" Maria looked surprised, then genuinely pleased. "You want to hear an old woman sing while we eat tamales?" "Very much." So Maria sang softly in Spanish while they ate at Frank's kitchen table on Christmas night. Her voice was gentle and warm, carrying melodies that spoke of celebration and family and the kind of deep joy that transcends language barriers. Frank didn't understand most of the words, but he understood the feeling, the sense that some moments are sacred not because of where they happen or who's involved, but because of the love that fills them. "That was beautiful," Frank said when she finished the song. "What was it about?" "Hope," Maria said simply. "My grandmother's favorite carol. She sang it every Christmas until she died at 97. Said it was about remembering that light always comes back, even in the darkest times." Hope. Frank had forgotten what that felt like, the belief that things could get better instead of just different. "Tell me about your family," Frank said, surprising himself with the question. When was the last time he'd asked someone about their life instead of waiting for them to ask about his? When had he stopped being curious about other people's stories? Maria's face brightened immediately. "My daughter Carmen lives in Phoenix with her husband and 3 children. She teaches 2nd grade, sends me pictures of her students' artwork every week. Little masterpieces made with crayons and construction paper and so much heart." She pulled out her phone and showed Frank a photo of a classroom bulletin board covered in colorful drawings. "My son Roberto is in the army, stationed in Germany right now. He comes home in March. Wants to study engineering when he gets out." "That's wonderful," Frank said, and meant it completely. "You must be incredibly proud." "Very proud," Maria said. "But proud and lonely aren't opposites, you know. You can be both at the same time. You can love your children desperately and still ache for their presence every single day." Frank nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The particular pain of loving people who lived entire lives you weren't part of. "What about your children?" Maria asked gently, without the forced cheerfulness most people used when asking about family. Frank hesitated. The automatic response was to say they were fine, successful, busy with their own lives. The polite fiction that kept people from asking uncomfortable follow-up questions. Instead, he told the truth. "I have 3 children. Michael, Jenny, and Tommy. All grown, all successful, all living what appear to be happy lives. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being someone they wanted to spend time with and became someone they felt obligated to manage." Maria listened without judgment, without trying to fix or explain or offer empty reassurances. "After my wife died, I think I became Frank searched for the right word. Difficult. I was drowning in grief, and I wanted them to throw me a life preserver. But instead of asking for help, I started demanding proof that they still loved me. I began keeping score, how often they called, how long they visited, whether they remembered important dates. I became the kind of father who made them feel guilty instead of loved. And now, Frank gestured at the empty house around them, at the silent phone, at the Christmas dinner for one. Now they're all too busy to spend holidays with their needy, difficult father. And I can't even blame them, because I taught them that loving me was exhausting. Maybe they don't know how, Maria said quietly. How to what? How to love someone who's in pain. Sometimes when people are hurting, they push others away and then get angry when people actually stay away. Maybe your children want to help but don't know how to reach through your hurt to find you. Frank considered this possibility. Had his children interpreted his neediness as rejection? His questions as accusations? His loneliness as criticism of their life choices? Had he been speaking a language of pain they didn't know how to understand? I don't know how to be different, Frank admitted. Sarah was the one who knew how to love people without keeping track of what she got back. I'm just angry and old and tired of pretending I don't need anyone. Needing people isn't the problem, Maria said. But expecting them to guess what you need, then getting hurt when they guess wrong, that's where families break apart. They talked until almost 11 o'clock. Maria told him about her childhood in Guadalajara, about learning to make tortillas on a comal her great-grandmother had brought from Spain, about meeting her husband at a church dance when she was 19 and he was 21 and they both believed love could conquer anything. She talked about coming to America with nothing but hope and 2 cardboard suitcases, about raising children in a language that wasn't her first, about the particular challenge of being widowed young in a country that sometimes still felt foreign. Frank found himself talking about Sarah, not the saint he'd created in his memory to make his grief more noble, but the real woman who'd been his partner for 43 years. About their fights and reconciliations, about the way she'd made him laugh even when he was determined to stay angry, about how she taught him that love wasn't a feeling you had but a choice you made every day. She sounds like she was wonderful, Maria said. She was. But she's gone, and I don't know how to be the man she loved without her here to remind me who that was. Maybe that's the wrong question, Maria said gently. What do you mean? Maybe instead of trying to be the man she loved, you should try to be the man who could love the way she did. Love without keeping score. Love without conditions. Love that shows up even when it's not convenient. The words hit Frank like a physical blow, not because they hurt but because they illuminated something he'd been unable to see. He'd been so focused on being worthy of Sarah's love that he'd forgotten how to love the way Sarah had, freely, generously, without expecting anything in return. Maria stood to leave around 10:45, carefully packing the leftover food into containers for Frank to keep. The rice pudding alone would feed him for 3 days, and the remaining tamales could be frozen and reheated whenever he needed comfort food that actually brought comfort. Thank you for dinner, she said as Frank walked her to the door, as if he'd been the one providing hospitality instead of receiving it. Thank you for saving Christmas, Frank said, and meant it with every cell in his body. Christmas isn't about the day, Maria said, wrapping her red cardigan tighter against the cold wind that had picked up while they were inside. It's about remembering that we're not meant to be alone. That love shows up in small ways, in ordinary moments, in the choice to knock on someone's door with a plate of food because you can't stand the thought of them eating alone. After she left, Frank stood in his doorway watching her careful progress through the snow. Her footsteps were small but sure, and she turned once to wave before disappearing into her own house 3 doors down. The night felt completely different now, not empty, but full of possibility. The silence in Frank's house wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful, expectant, like the pause between movements in a symphony. Frank went to his study and pulled out the will he'd updated 6 months earlier when his lawyer had called about some routine tax changes. Standard legal language, everything split 3 ways between the children, a few small charitable bequests, the kind of document that assumed love where there might only be legal obligation. He stared at it for a long time, thinking about Maria's words. About love as choice rather than feeling. About the difference between expecting love and creating conditions where love could flourish. Frank pulled out a fresh sheet of letterhead and began to write. My children, he started, then stopped. Crossed it out. Started again. To my children. The words came slowly at first, then faster as 3 years of accumulated hurt and hope poured onto the page. Everything he'd never said, everything that had calcified into resentment and bitterness over the years since Sarah died. But also everything he still believed was possible, everything he hoped they might still find their way back to. I know I became difficult after your mother died. I know I made you feel guilty for having your own lives, your own families, your own priorities that didn't always include me. I know I kept score when I should have kept faith. Tonight a neighbor, a woman I barely know, knocked on my door with a plate of food and reminded me what love actually looks like. Not keeping track of who calls whom or measuring visits like currency, but simply showing up when someone needs you. Giving without expecting anything in return. I spent tonight thinking about the kind of father I want to be remembered as. Not the one who demanded your time and attention, but the one who treasured whatever time you could give. Not the one who made you feel guilty for having full lives, but the one who celebrated your happiness even when it didn't include me. I hope there's still time for me to learn how to love you the way your mother did, without conditions, without expectations, without making my loneliness your responsibility. I hope you can forgive a stubborn old man who forgot that love is something you give, not something you earn. But if there isn't time, if you're reading this because I'm gone and we never figured out how to find our way back to each other, then I want you to know this: I love you. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry I forgot how to show it in ways that felt like love instead of obligation. Everything I have, I leave to Maria Santos, who reminded me on the loneliest night of my life that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to care for each other, especially when caring is inconvenient. I hope this reminds you that loneliness has a cost, but so does love freely given. One destroys everything it touches. The other creates something beautiful, even in the darkest moments. I hope you choose love. I hope you find people who knock on your door with plates of food and songs in languages you don't understand but feelings you recognize. I hope you become the kind of people who knock on other people's doors. I love you more than my hurt feelings. I love you more than my loneliness. I love you enough to want you to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't always include me. Your father. Frank sealed the letter and placed it with his important papers. Then he sat at his computer and began typing emails to his children, not demands or guilt trips or lectures about their absence, but simple messages saying he loved them, he was proud of them, and he hoped they'd had wonderful Christmas celebrations with their families. He didn't mention his loneliness. Didn't point out that they hadn't called. Didn't ask for anything in return. Just love, freely offered, without conditions or expectations. For the first time in 3 years, Frank Delacroix went to bed on Christmas night feeling hopeful instead of hollow. He had no way of knowing that his aging heart, stressed by years of grief and loneliness, would stop beating sometime before dawn. He had no way of knowing that his last conscious thought would be gratitude for Maria Santos and her plate of tamales. He had no way of knowing that in 7 days, his children would be sitting in a lawyer's office, learning the true cost of taking love for granted. But that night, for the first time since Sarah died, Frank fell asleep believing that love freely given might still be love freely returned. And maybe, just maybe, that belief was enough to change everything. What do you think Frank's children will do when they discover what their father's loneliness actually cost them? Will they learn the lesson he tried to teach, or will they miss the point entirely? Drop a comment and share your thoughts about whether people can really change when the stakes are this high. And if this story is making you think about the people in your own life who might be eating soup alone tonight, hit subscribe and share this with someone who needs to remember that love shows up in small ways, in ordinary moments, in the choice to check on people even when, especially when, it's inconvenient. The call came on a Tuesday morning in January while Jenny Delacroix Morrison was sitting in her pristine suburban kitchen, scrolling through her phone and drinking coffee from a mug that read, "World's Best Mom," a Mother's Day gift from Emma that now felt like evidence in a trial she didn't know she was facing. "Ms. Delacroix. This is Detective Morrison with the Chester County Police. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your father." The words hit Jenny like ice water in her veins, but what she felt wasn't grief, it was relief. Immediate, shameful, undeniable relief that flooded through her body before she could stop it. No more guilt about not visiting enough. No more awkward phone calls where Dad asked pointed questions about why they never came around. No more reminders of everything she was failing to be as a daughter. Heart attack, the detective continued. Sometime Monday night. The mailman noticed newspapers piling up, contacted a neighbor who had a key. "I'm sorry for your loss." But what Jenny didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their father had spent his final conscious moments rewriting his will and updating his life insurance beneficiaries. What she couldn't possibly imagine was that Frank Delacroix had used his last hours on Earth to teach his children the most expensive lesson of their lives. The funeral was exactly what Frank would have expected, small, perfunctory, and attended mostly by people who'd known Sarah. Jenny, Michael, and Tommy sat in the front row of St. Mary's like proper grieving children, accepting condolences with appropriate solemnity while mentally calculating inheritance splits and wondering when they could get back to their real lives. Michael had flown in from Seattle, his wife Kristen staying home because someone needed to watch the kids. Tommy drove up from Austin in his new BMW, already fielding work calls before the service even started. Jenny arrived with David and the children, who fidgeted through the mass and asked loudly when they could go home. Father Mackenzie delivered a generic homily about Frank's devotion to his late wife and his love for his family. The lies felt appropriate somehow. Funerals were supposed to be about comfort, not truth. But in the third row, Maria Santos cried real tears into a worn tissue, mourning a man who'd spent his final Christmas evening laughing at her stories and singing along to Spanish lullabies. She was the only person in that church who would actually miss Frank Delacroix, and she was the only one who had no idea that her kindness was about to make her very, very wealthy. After the service, they gathered at Brennan and Son's funeral home for the reading of the will. The lawyer, a tired-looking man named Peterson who'd known Frank for 20 years, spread documents across the polished conference table like he was dealing cards in a game nobody wanted to play. "This is relatively straightforward," Peterson said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Your father updated his will on December 26th, which supersedes all previous versions." December 26th. The day after Christmas. The day after they'd all been too busy to call. "Before we discussed the distributions, your father left specific instructions that this letter be read aloud to all beneficiaries present." Peterson held up a sealed envelope with Frank's careful handwriting across the front. "Would you prefer I read it, or would one of you like to?" Michael, ever the responsible eldest child, reached for the letter with hands that trembled slightly. His successful architect's fingers, the same ones that had drawn blueprints for million-dollar homes, shook as he tore open the envelope. Inside were 3 pages covered in their father's meticulous script, the handwriting they'd seen on birthday cards and report card signatures and grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator throughout their childhood. "To my children," Michael began, his voice steady and professional. "I suppose I should start by saying I love you, because I do, even though I'm not sure you'll believe that by the end of this letter." Jenny shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. Wills were supposed to be boring legal documents, not, whatever this was becoming. "I've spent the last 3 years since your mother died trying to figure out where I went wrong as a father. Was I too demanding? Too critical? Did I expect too much, or not enough? Was I the kind of parent who drove his children away through sheer disappointment?" Michael's voice caught slightly. He cleared his throat and continued reading, the words hitting the room like physical blows. "But sitting alone on Christmas night, eating soup from a can while my children celebrated with their real families, I realized I was asking the wrong questions. The question isn't what I did wrong. The question is, when did you decide I wasn't worth the effort anymore?" Tommy looked up from his phone for the first time since they'd sat down. Jenny felt her stomach drop into her expensive shoes. "Michael, you live exactly 43 miles from Seattle to your CrossFit gym, a distance you travel twice a week without complaint. But somehow those same 43 miles between Seattle and Pennsylvania were insurmountable when it came to visiting your father on Christmas. I kept track, son. I saw your Instagram posts about hiking trips and weekend getaways. 43 miles was never too far. I just wasn't worth the drive." Michael's face flushed deep red. He'd posted those hiking photos on social media, never thinking his 74-year-old father paid attention to Instagram stories. Never imagining that every adventure he documented was evidence that he'd simply stopped prioritizing the man who'd raised him. "Jenny, your children weren't sick on Christmas. I know because I drove past your house on December 26th and saw Emma and Jack playing in the yard, healthy as horses. You just didn't want to deal with your sad, lonely father ruining your perfect family holiday." Jenny's mouth fell open. He'd driven past her house. He'd been checking up on her, verifying her lies. The thought of her father sitting in his car outside her home, watching his grandchildren play while knowing he'd been deliberately excluded, made her feel physically sick. "And Tommy. Tommy, you weren't swamped with work. You were in Vail, living it up with Chelsea's family, posting videos of champagne toasts and ski slopes while your father ate soup alone in the house where you grew up." Tommy's face had gone completely pale. Every Instagram story, every Snapchat video, every social media post he'd shared from that ski trip, his father had seen them all. Had watched his youngest son choose a girlfriend's family over his own and document the choice for the world to see. "I want you to understand something," Michael continued reading, his voice growing shakier with each word. "This isn't about money, though money seems to be the only language any of you speak anymore. This is about consequences. This is about learning that actions, and deliberate inactions, have costs that compound over time until they become unbearable." Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. In 30 years of practicing law, he'd never presided over a will reading that felt more like a public execution. For 3 years, I've been dying a little more each day. Not from old age or illness, but from the slow realization that I had raised 3 children who grew up to become the kind of adults who abandon their parents when caring becomes inconvenient. Who make excuses instead of efforts. Who choose comfort over compassion every single time. Jenny was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streams. But whether from grief or rage or pure shame, she couldn't tell. I hope this will serve as a reminder that loneliness has a cost, but so does indifference. Everything I own, everything I worked for during 45 years of marriage and fatherhood, goes to Maria Elena Santos of 1247, Maple Street. Michael stopped reading. The silence in the room was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I'm sorry, Tommy said, his voice cracking. Did he just say everything goes to some random neighbor? Peterson cleared his throat nervously. The will is quite specific and legally binding. The entire estate, house, savings accounts, investment portfolio, life insurance, personal property, transfers in its entirety to Ms. Santos. The total value is approximately $427,000. $427,000. Jenny's portion alone would have paid off their mortgage and the kids' college funds. Michael was already calculating how much his share would have helped with Kristen's medical bills and the renovation loan. Tommy was thinking about the startup capital he'd been hoping to get for his new business venture. All of it, gone. Given to a woman none of them had ever met. This can't be legal, Tommy exploded, shoving his chair back from the table. He was obviously not in his right mind. We'll contest this. No court would uphold a will this insane. Actually, Peterson said quietly, your father anticipated that reaction. The will was witnessed by 3 independent parties, including Dr. Martinez, who examined your father the day before he died and found him completely competent. There's also this. Peterson produced a thick manila envelope. Your father had a full psychological evaluation done on December 27, specifically to establish his mental capacity. He also videotaped himself explaining his reasoning. The documentation is ironclad. There's more to the letter, Michael said quietly, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper. Don't waste money on lawyers trying to contest this will. Don't make attorneys rich fighting over money you never cared about when I was alive to give it to you freely. Instead, ask yourselves this. When was the last time any of you did something for me just because you loved me, not because you felt obligated? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jenny tried to remember the last time she'd called her father just to talk, not because it was his birthday or a holiday. Michael was thinking about all the times he'd cut phone calls short because Kristen was making dinner or the kids needed help with homework. Tommy couldn't recall a single conversation with his father in the past year that hadn't been interrupted by work emails or text messages. When was the last time you visited just because you wanted to see me, not because it was Christmas or my birthday and you felt guilty? When was the last time you included me in your lives instead of managing me like an obligation on your to-do list? Michael's voice was barely above a whisper now, the words scraping against his throat like broken glass. Maria Santos knocked on my door on the worst night of my life and made it better. She didn't have to. She gained nothing from it except the satisfaction of treating another human being with basic kindness. She brought me homemade food and listened to my stories and sang Christmas carols in Spanish until my house felt like a home again instead of a mausoleum. Through the conference room window, they could see Maria Santos in the parking lot, standing next to an old Honda Civic that had seen better years. She was crying and appeared to be having some kind of phone conversation, probably trying to process what had just happened to her life. That's what family does. That's what love looks like when it's not contaminated by obligation or guilt or the expectation of reciprocity. Maria reminded me that I deserved better than children who treated me like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. The words hit each of them differently but with equal devastation. Jenny was remembering all the times she'd sighed audibly when her father's number appeared on her caller ID. Michael was thinking about the way he'd always made their conversations about scheduling logistics rather than actual connection. Tommy was realizing that he'd spent more time in the past year talking to his barista than to his father. I'm sorry you never learned the difference between loving someone and going through the motions of loving someone. I'm sorry I failed to teach you that family isn't just about shared DNA, it's about choosing to show up for each other, especially when showing up is inconvenient or uncomfortable. Michael folded the letter carefully, but his hands were shaking so badly that Peterson had to help him. There's a postscript, Michael said, his voice breaking completely. P.S. Maria, you were the daughter I needed in my final years. Thank you for reminding me what unconditional kindness looks like. Use this money to visit your children, to help your son through college, to never worry about being alone and forgotten. You deserve every penny, and I only wish I could have given you more." The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy stormed out first, his face purple with rage, muttering about lawyers and legal challenges and the injustice of it all. Jenny followed, sobbing uncontrollably, not from grief for her father but from the devastating realization of what her indifference had cost her family. Michael sat alone with Peterson for several minutes, staring at the letter that had just destroyed his financial future and forced him to confront the kind of son he'd become. Was he? Michael's voice was hoarse. Was he really that lonely? Peterson, who'd known Frank for 2 decades, nodded sadly. Your father called me 6 months ago asking about updating his will. Said he wanted to make sure his money went to people who would appreciate it rather than people who felt entitled to it. I tried to talk him out of it, suggested family counseling, recommended he give you all another chance. What did he say? He said he'd been giving you chances for 3 years, and chances without consequences aren't really chances at all. They're just enablement. Outside in the parking lot, Maria Santos was still crying, still trying to process the phone call she'd just had with her daughter in Phoenix. $427,000. More money than she'd seen in her entire 68 years of life. Money that could pay off her small mortgage, help Roberto through engineering school, maybe even let her visit Carmen and the grandchildren she only knew through Facebook photos. But all she could think about was Frank Delacroix sitting alone in his kitchen on Christmas night, eating soup from a can while his children lived full lives that didn't include him. Jenny approached her tentatively, mascara streaked down her face like war paint. Excuse me. Are you Maria Santos? Yes, Maria said softly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. I'm Jenny. I'm Frank's daughter. Maria's expression shifted to something that might have been pity. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man. You barely knew him, Jenny said, and immediately regretted the words. They came out sharp and accusatory when she'd meant them to sound questioning. You're right, Maria said simply. I knew him for exactly 4 hours. But in those 4 hours, he told me about the daughter who used to make him breakfast in bed on Mother's Day and nearly burned down the kitchen. About the little girl who cried on her first day of kindergarten until he promised to pick her up early. About how proud he was when you became a mother yourself. Jenny felt like she'd been slapped. He talked about me, he talked about all of you. With so much love, but also so much sadness. He said he didn't know how to be the father you needed him to be anymore. So you think you deserved his money more than his own children? The words came out crueler than Jenny intended, but she was too hurt and angry to care about kindness. Maria looked at her for a long moment, her dark eyes full of something that might have been compassion. I think your father was dying of loneliness, and none of you noticed. I think he spent 3 years trying to figure out how to matter to the people who mattered most to him, and nobody helped him find the answer. We had our own lives. Our own families. Our own problems. Yes, Maria said simply. And now you have to live with the choice you made about what was more important. Jenny wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain all the complicated reasons why maintaining a relationship with her difficult father had felt impossible. But standing there in the funeral home parking lot, looking at this small woman who'd shown her father more kindness in one evening than Jenny had managed in 3 years, the explanations felt hollow. What are you going to do with the money? Jenny asked. Maria was quiet for a moment, staring at the snow-covered cars in the parking lot. Your father mentioned that you have children. Emma and Jack. Jenny nodded, surprised. He said Emma wants to be a veterinarian. That Jack loves building things, might be an engineer someday. Maria smiled sadly. He was so proud of them. Kept their school pictures in his wallet. You're not going to give us the money, are you? Jenny asked, already knowing the answer. Your father made his choice for a reason, Maria said. But I want you to know something. The night I knocked on his door, he wasn't angry at you. He was just heartbroken. He said he didn't know how to love you in a way that felt like love instead of obligation. Maria got into her old Honda and drove away, leaving Jenny standing alone in the parking lot with the weight of everything she'd lost, not just the inheritance, but the father she'd never quite learned how to love properly while she still had the chance. 6 months later, Maria Santos used Frank's money to visit her daughter in Phoenix for the first time in 8 years. She helped Roberto through his final year of engineering school and put a down payment on a small house near the university where he could visit her easily. She started a scholarship fund at the local community college for students whose parents had died young, because she understood that some kinds of loneliness required practical solutions. Jenny divorced David 18 months later, not because of the lost inheritance but because Frank's letter had forced her to examine what kind of love she was modeling for her children. She moved back to Pennsylvania and bought a small house 3 miles from her father's old neighborhood. Every Christmas, she takes Emma and Jack to visit Frank's grave, and they leave tamales that Maria Santos teaches them to make. Michael and Kristen lost their house when her medical bills became unmanageable without the inheritance they'd been counting on. They moved into a smaller place and learned to live with less, but Michael started calling his mother-in-law every Sunday and visiting her every month, because Frank's letter had taught him that time was the only gift that actually mattered. Tommy's startup failed, and he moved back to Pennsylvania to work for a company that paid less but gave him more time with the family he'd been neglecting. He never married Chelsea. Turned out that someone who could watch you abandon your father wasn't someone you could trust with your own future. None of them ever forgot the lesson Frank taught them about the cost of taking love for granted. But they learned it too late to thank the man who'd sacrificed everything to make sure they learned it at all. Maria Santos kept one of Frank's Christmas village houses, the little church from the year Michael was born. Every December, she plugs it in and lets its tiny light glow in her window, a reminder that love shows up in the smallest gestures, and that sometimes the most powerful acts of kindness come from strangers who choose to see our humanity when our own families have forgotten we possess it. Frank Delacroix died alone, but his last act created more love in the world than his children had managed in years. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is force people to confront the true cost of their choices. Sometimes the only way to teach someone about love is to show them what life looks like without it. And sometimes, just sometimes, people actually learn. The end. What did you think of Frank's final lesson? Did his children deserve to lose their inheritance, or was his punishment too harsh? Have you ever taken someone's love for granted until it was too late? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts about whether people can really change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. If this story made you think about the people in your own life who might be eating soup alone tonight, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to remember that love shows up in small ways, in ordinary moments, in the choice to knock on someone's door with a plate of food. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us it's never too late to choose love over convenience, until suddenly, it is. The most devastating truth about family isn't that we stop loving each other. It's that we stop showing up for each other, one small choice at a time, until love becomes nothing more than a word we use to avoid feeling guilty about our neglect. Frank Delacroix spent his last Christmas learning the difference between love and obligation. His children learned it at his funeral. Which kind of love are you giving to the people who matter most to you?